Welcome to the Georgia Archives Virtual Lunch and Learn program. I'm Penny Cliff, Education Specialist here at the Georgia Archives. We're so glad that you've joined us for our July presentation, The All-Americans of the 82nd Airborne Division and Operation Husky, the Allied Invasion of Sicily, 9th through 10th of July 1943, presented by retired Army Command Sergeant Major Chris Lewis, who now serves as the Director of Education and Volunteer Services at the National Infantry Museum in Columbus. Now, if you have any friends or family who are unable to view this live event, they still can enjoy this presentation as it will be uploaded to the Georgia Archives YouTube channel. Our Lunch and Learn programs are held on the second Friday of the month. We are so pleased to have Director of Education and Volunteer Services, Chris Lewis. Chris will answer any of your questions at the end of this presentation, so write them down. Retired Command Sergeant Major Christopher Lewis has an impressive record. And here are just a few of his many achievements. He's been the Director of Education and Volunteer Services for the National Infantry Museum Foundation since February 2020. He's originally from Foxborough, Massachusetts, entering the United States Army in 1987 at Fort Benning, Georgia. In his 32 years of service, he served in a variety of assignments to include airborne, mechanized,
yeah.
Thank you, mechanized. I didn't have any problems with this one. Infantry, light infantry and striker units, including the 1st Armored Division, 1st Infantry Division, 3rd Infantry Division, 10th Mountain Division, and the 82nd Airborne Division. He also performed additional duties as an Army recruiter and as a senior drill sergeant. Chris has served numerous positions within a mortar section and a mortar platoon, and has also served as a Striker Infantry Company First Sergeant, Brigade Operations, and most recently, the Battalion Command Sergeant Major for the 1st Battalion, 50th Infantry Regiment at Fort Benning, Georgia. He has 6 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and 4 peacekeeping and security assistant missions to the Balkans. Chris is currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in history with the University of Maryland University College. He is a member of the Board of Directors for the National Infantry Association and is the unit historian for the 551st Parachute Infantry Association. He is married to the former Miss Mikey Steen of Fayetteville, North Carolina, and has one son, Samuel Gavin Lewis, who is a college student at Virginia Tech. We're happy to welcome the Director of Education and Volunteer Services at the National Infantry Museum in Columbus, Chris Lewis. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Penny. Thanks for quite the introduction. I don't think I'm that deserving of it, but I appreciate it. So folks, again, my name is Chris Lewis. I'm the Education Director of Education and Volunteer Services for the National Infantry Museum, right down the street in Fort Benning, Georgia. And today's Lunch and Learn, when Penny reached out to me about doing this presentation today, the fact that it was on the 9th of July kind of struck a chord with me. So folks, as we're talking today, what we're going to talk about today is the 82nd Airborne Division and Operation Husky, which was the Allied invasion of Sicily, which took place on the 9th and 10th of July, 1943. So 78 years ago today is the operation we're going to talk about today. Okay, so here's the overview of what we're going to talk about today, folks. We'll do an initial overview of what was going on in the Mediterranean theater at that point, why there was the need for Operation Husky, the disposition of forces, both enemy and allied forces in the Mediterranean at that point. Then we'll talk specifically about the 82nd Airborne Division in North Africa, their preparations for the jump, and then the two main airborne operations for Operation Husky. Husky 1, which was the 505th Parachute Regimental Combat Team, and Husky 2, which was the 504th Parachute Infantry. We'll talk about the amphibious landings that happened at the same time, and then a very unfortunate friendly fire incident that happened during that operation that would have significance on how operations would be conducted almost a year later during the Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day in June 1944. Talk about the use of the CG-4A gliders. That's a special connection with the Infantry Museum. We'll get to that here in a little bit. And then we'll discuss the operations once they did get on the ground in Sicily. One of the key things being the Battle of Biazole Ridge on the 11th of July, 1943. Then we'll do a conclusion, and then we'll be open for questions, and hopefully I can answer any questions everybody has today. Okay, so here's the overview. So the night of the 9th and 10th of July, 1943, the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division performed the first regimental-sized combat jump during the Second World War. As the vanguard of the massive Allied invasion force during Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. It would take 38 days to secure the island but Sicily would become the first Axis territory, or not a country, but because it was part of Italy, but the first Axis territory that would fall to the Allies during the Second World War. It would quickly become a logistics base and a training center to launch continued attacks and to attack Italy and try to topple Mussolini in his fascist Italy. But a lot of the lessons learned during this operation with every one of the soldier sailors, paratroopers, and officers that participated in this operation gave a lot of hard lessons learned that would come to play not even 11 months later during the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Okay, so let's do a little backstory. Some of the initial planning and an overview of what was going on. So it's this picture here. This is the Casablanca Conference, which was held in Casablanca in Morocco from 14 to 24 January 1943. Now, originally it was supposed to be President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Stalin, but Stalin was unable to make the meeting simply because there was a massive German assault going on in his country on the Eastern Front, to include the defense of Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. So he just simply couldn't be there at that meeting. But at this meeting, strategic plans for the Axis, strategic plans for how we were going to fight the Axis in the Mediterranean for 1943 and beyond were discussed, as well as agreeing on a unified policy of unconditional surrender for the Axis countries when that time came. They also decided that as soon as North Africa was secure, they would concentrate their efforts in the Mediterranean by launching an invasion on the island of Sicily, which Winston Churchill's very famously coined the term, he called Sicily the soft underbelly of Europe. That would be used, of course, to follow on attack against the Italian mainland, again, to hope eventually get Italy to surrender and oust Mussolini from power, excuse me. So some other significant points about the Casablanca Conference that come into play for Operation Husky. So the Allied parties that were at the Casablanca Conference, they agreed to concentrate Allied efforts against Germany specifically, to include strategic bombing to try to draw some pressure off the Russians, who are having a really tough time against the Germans on the Eastern Front. They agreed to increase shipments of supplies to the Soviet Union. And then they also agreed to start beginning the buildup of Allied forces in England for the eventual invasion of Europe, with the landings they agreed would be someplace in northern France that they would take. So a lot of key events strategically happened at the Casablanca Conference that would affect how the war was going to go for the next few years. Now this photo here, from left to right, you see French General Henri Giraud, then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Charles de Gaulle, and then Prime Minister Winston Churchill were the key players in the Casablanca Conference. And what's interesting too, if you look here, so there's President Roosevelt riding in a Willys Jeep. He actually went before he left the conference and met with soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division. This is the color guard that is meeting him when he went to see them. He actually had lunch with them, eating a very simple soldier's meal out of a tin mess kit of Spam and string beans and coffee. So kind of neat to say if you were a young soldier having lunch in North Africa with the President of the United States. So kind of cool. Okay, to kind of give you an overview of what was going on in North Africa at this point. So in November 1942, we had Operation Torch, and that was the Allied invasion of North Africa. And this part of Morocco, and then Spanish and French Morocco. By May of 1943, we had slowly pushed eastward, engaging Rommel's, the German forces under Erwin Rommel, the Afrika Corps, who were very formidable fighters and a very tremendous combat record and capability to bring to the battlefield. But by the middle to the end of May of 43, we pretty much had secured North Africa up to Tunisia. So this was the springboard. If you look here where the arrows pointing, right about here is the city of Kairouan, which would be the main staging base for the 82nd to launch their attack against Sicily, which you can see right here. Okay, so that now in May of 1943, they really start getting focused on Operation Husky and figuring out how they are going to attack Sicily amongst all the Allied forces. So in this photo here, you can see Prime Minister Winston Churchill's in the center. He's meeting with other Allied leaders to plan the operation. If you look very closely, to his left, where the point where I'm going to point to these guys here, is General George C. Marshall, who is the Chief of Staff of the Army at that point. To his right is General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a three-star commander of all the Allied forces in the Mediterranean at that point. And then behind him is the Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, who was the supreme leader for all British forces in the Mediterranean. So a lot of heavy hitters. And what's unique is they're doing their planning on basically, it looks like a small card table. They're going to start planning this massive operation that will take place only a few months later. So if we look here, so let's look at the disposition of forces, both enemy and friendly, in and around Sicily. So the Allied force headquarters for the Mediterranean was led by General Eisenhower. Now he's a three-star general at this point, but it was agreed upon that he would be the supreme Allied commander for the Mediterranean forces. The next, underneath him, was the Allied 15th Army Group, which was led by a British General Alexander, which was a component, just a smaller, lower headquarters that would be specifically directing the attack on Sicily. So the two main army groups that would attack, that would comprise the attack against the invasion of Sicily. So the U.S. 7th Army, led by the legend himself, General George Patton, would lead the 7th Army with 2 corps underneath him, led by General Omar Bradley, and 3 very seasoned infantry divisions. The 1st Infantry Division, the 3rd Infantry Division, and the 45th Infantry Division. So that would be the U.S. component of the amphibious assault onto Sicily. The British 8th Army, led by Montgomery, with 13 Corps, led by General Dempsey, would have 3 regular infantry divisions, and then the 1st Airborne Division, led by General Browning. And if you can, folks, if you look here at the map, so this part of here around Gala, which is where right at the tip of the pointer, this would be the U.S. invasion area, and then the British would come ashore here, and here's the town of Syracuse down to the southern tip of Sicily. So that would be the 2 main areas that would hit simultaneously. Now, noticeably, I've got the patch of my beloved 82nd Airborne Division, led by Major General Matthew B. Ridgway here off the side. The reason why is in the initial planning for Husky, the 82nd was not considered to be used part of the initial assault elements. They're going to be kept as a reserve simply because there wasn't a great understanding of airborne operations and how to use parachute and glider troops. Because it was, again, it was this new concept to a lot of folks still in the Army. As a historical note, so this is July 1943. It was only 3 years prior that right down the street here at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Airborne Test Platoon did their first airborne operation in our Army's history. 46 enlisted guys and 2 officers, and that was the first airborne operation. They jumped right on Lawson Army Airfield at Fort Benning. 3 years later, you have a whole division of airborne and glider guys, and I just think there was some apprehension to know what exactly to do with them, which is why originally the 82nd was not part of the initial planning and only be used as a reserve force. Axis forces on the island of Sicily were about 250,000 Italians and between 40 to 60,000 German soldiers. So quite a huge amount of forces, that enemy forces on the island. And if you look at these red ovals and these red dotted lines, that's pretty much where the concentration of the German and Italian forces were on the island. Of note, I want you to notice here where it says the Hermann Goering Division, and we're going to hear about that division here later on in the presentation, because that's who the 82nd would end up fighting against in the early few days of the Operation Husky in Sicily. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the 82nd Airborne Division. So the 82nd Airborne Division was the first airborne designated division in our Army's history. So it was originally organized on 25 August 1917 at a place called Camp Gordon in Georgia. Now, not Fort Gordon, which exists over in Augusta, Georgia. So Camp Gordon, the original Camp Gordon, was actually in Chambly, Georgia, during World War I, which is where the 82nd was stood up as a division. There is a marker to where the 82nd was stood up, and it sits right next to the Peachtree DeKalb Executive Airport, just north of Atlanta. So there's a tie between the 82nd Infantry Division and the state of Georgia, because this is where we came from. The 82nd as an infantry division fought in France in several major battles, but one of the things probably the 82nd's most noted for in World War I is that one of the most famous Medal of Honor recipients of our country's history, Sergeant Alvin York, was assigned to Company G of the 328th Infantry of the 82nd Infantry Division during the First World War. And you can see here the red, white, and blue AA patch, and you can see it's on Sergeant York's shoulder here in a publicity photo after the war. Now, the red, white, and blue and the AA, where did that come from? So when the division was stood up at Camp Gordon here in Atlanta, they had a competition to figure out what would be a nickname, or what was they could identify themselves as an infantry division. The story goes is that they found out that there were soldiers from each of the 48 states in the division when they stood it up, so they adopted the nickname the All-Americans. So that's where the red, white, blue, and the AA come from for the shoulder insignia for the 82nd, not only in World War I, but up into this day as an airborne division. So during World War II, on 15 August 1942, the 82nd went from being an infantry division to the Army's 1st Airborne Division. That happened at a place called Camp Claiborne in Louisiana. Very quickly after that, the 82nd moved to Fort Bragg to conduct additional training, and then they were given movement orders to move overseas to prepare for the jump into Sicily. So in April 1943, the division was sent overseas on troop ships from New York City. They landed in Casablanca in North Africa on the 10th of May 1943, and after a few days, the division moved by train and by rail, aircraft, and truck to, and I'm really going to mess this name up, it's Ouida and Marnia in French Morocco, where they began training. Now, so the 82nd Airborne Division in North Africa. So while in North Africa, the paratroopers and the glidmen of the 82nd began an intensive training program to acclimatize themselves to the heat and the humidity of the Mediterranean. They conducted several training operations employing both glider and parachute troops. So here in this photo to the left, you can see the workhorse of the World War II, the Douglas C-47 Skytrain of the Troop Carrier Command. Not only was it critical to airborne units during World War II, but just about every part of the globe where the Allies needed transport, troop transport, supplies brought in, you can find the C-47s. Now in this photo, during a training mission in June of 1943, the C-47 is towing a CG-4 glider behind it, taking off from an airfield in Ouida in French Morocco. And if you look real closely, you can see the tow cable from the tail of the aircraft connected to the glider. It was about 150 to 200 feet long with a wire wrapped around it, and the wire was connected to a radio set in the glider. So the pilot and co-pilot in the glider could talk to the flight crew in the C-47 tow plane. In this other photo, you can, in this other photo, you can see two paratroopers from the 82nd on the same operation conducting a parachute jump with their T5 parachutes onto an undisclosed airfield, again in French Morocco. Some more photos of the training they were doing in North Africa. So here's a paratrooper of the 82nd getting ready to, as The term we use in the airborne is putting your knees in the breeze. So that's when you step out of the aircraft and the proper jump configuration to exit the C-47 aircraft while in flight. And then there's this great photo of three C-47s with the jumpers exiting the aircraft on one of the training jumps in French Morocco. Again, some more training photos. This is after that. So the previous photo that showed the jumpers coming out of the aircraft, this is on the drop zone after the jump. Three of the C-47s doing a low pass over the jumpers who have already landed in the drop zone and are beginning to gather up in their assembly areas to conduct whatever missions they had been given that day. And this photo is typical of one of the paratroopers from the 82nd in the Mediterranean at that point. The only thing he's missing is a parachute. So that thing that's around his neck, well, that's a Mae West, a life preserver. They would have all their equipment on, put the Mae West on, and then they put their parachutes on over it because they were flying over the Mediterranean to go to their objective. Now, so as we continue to prepare for the invasion of the upcoming invasion of Sicily. Now, the troopers of the division didn't know that it was coming. They knew they were getting ready for a mission, but there was only high-level leadership that knew that Sicily was going to be the target. So this photo on the left, you'll see Colonel James Gavin. James Maurice Gavin was the 35-year-old regimental commander of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. In this photo, he's conducting an in-rank inspection of his paratroopers and their combat equipment, all laid out to the front, sometime in June or July 1943. The regimental S3 officer is this gentleman here. His name is Major Benjamin van der Voort, standing off to the right. Now, that name might sound familiar to some of the World War II buffs or history guys that are listening into this presentation. So Major van der Voort would be promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he leads the 2nd Battalion of the 505th into St. Mary-Glise during D-Day on June 6, 1944. But he's also who the actor John Wayne portrays in the movie The Longest Day. That's Benjamin van der Voort. So pretty good claim to fame to say not only you a paratrooper in the 82nd, but John Wayne was the only guy that can handle playing you in a movie. So, but van der Voort was a great leader, as was General Gavin. Here on the right, so you see Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower inspecting Alpha Company of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment with its company commander here to the left, Captain William Willard Harrison, on 15 June 1943. So not even basically just short of a month before the Sicily operation. Now, behind Captain Harrison, right behind him is Major General Matthew B. Ridgway, who was the division commander of the 82nd Airborne Division. Behind Eisenhower, you see General Mark Clark, who was the commander of the 5th Army as a 3-star general. So the 82nd was getting a lot of visits by leadership because these generals, as I said earlier, didn't really understand how to employ airborne forces on the battlefield. So they wanted to come see what their capability was and the equipment they had and that kind of stuff. So it was kind of an important time for them. As they continue to train and prepare for the assault into Sicily, so the CG-4A Waco gliders, so you had parachute infantry regiments, which obviously they jumped into combat, and then you had glider infantry regiments or glider artillery units. So how did they get to combat? Were these CG-4A Waco gliders. So the gliders could carry about 6,000 pounds of equipment, 13 men or 13 troops, and in this case, either a 75 millimeter pack howitzer on the left or a Willys Jeep on the right. And you notice how the nose is tilted up. Well, that's where the pilot and the co-pilot would sit. So they would put the equipment inside the glider, lash it down as tight as they could with ropes, and then that's how they would fly the heavier equipment into combat during the early part of World War II. What's interesting too is hopefully if you guys get a chance soon to visit the National Infantry Museum, we actually have a Waco CG-4A glider from World War II suspended from the ceiling in our museum. It's one of only 11 left in the world of the more than I think 40,000 that were built during the Second World War. So this photo here just shows one of the paratroopers of the 82nd interacting with the local populace, and as I said here, it's a little hot, I'm sure, in North Africa in July of 1943. So water is always critical because they didn't slow down their training to prepare for this combat jump into Sicily. Now here's an equipment layout for a paratrooper of the 505th Regimental Combat Team who would have been armed with a M1928 45 caliber Thompson submachine gun, which you can see here. So some of the equipment that you can see, he's got a gas mask because there still was the potential that the Germans would use chemical agents or mustard gas at least on us. Trench knife, first aid kit, canteen. You can see here the binoculars and the binocular case, hand grenades, compass, malaria pills, flashlight, and then a delicious K ration, which was basically a canned meat something, and then some biscuits and crackers, coffee, and not the greatest, but that was the rations that they would jump into combat with. Here is some more equipment displays. So to the left is a paratrooper sniper of the 82nd with his M1903A4 Springfield 30 caliber sniper rifle. And to the right is another equipment display for a guy from the 505th who would have carried his M1 Garand rifle, ammunition, grenades, again, gas mask, just all the equipment, which is in essence would be anywhere from 65 to 85 pounds of gear they were going to jump into combat with. If you notice closely, you can see on the side of this helmet, that's what we call the rampant lion symbol. So the regiments adopted helmet emblems that they would paint on the side of their helmets. So as you were moving across the terrain, either off of the drop zone or on a patrol, you could recognize what regiment guys were in based on the emblem that was painted on the side of their helmet. So the 505th, they used the rampant lion symbol. So you can see it right there on that helmet right there. Okay, so final preparations for the jump. So they are given the mission order around the 5th of July, excuse me, that they're going to jump on Sicily. So very quickly they go into last minute preparations to get ready for the jump. Packing equipment, packing parachutes, loading ammunition, you name it. They've got to get everything ready to conduct this operation. So here you can see flight crews, or C-47 flight crews, looking at a map. So this is their air mission briefing for the jump. They will the flight route they'll take across the Mediterranean to Sicily, and then what they're going to do once they go over the drop zones. And if you notice these two gentlemen here, there's also two officers from the 82nd that are listening on that briefing as well. The biggest problem was, since about half of the American C-47s that were available in theater at that point were needed by the British for the British airborne units participation in this operation. Because of that, they wouldn't be able to drop the 82nd in one airborne operation. So it was split into two drops. The 505th Regimental Combat Team would jump on the night of 9 to 10 July, and then the following night, the 504th Regimental Combat Team, or late on the night of the 10th of July into the morning of the 11th, would be dropped. So they have two consecutive drops separated by about 24 hours. And it's funny, you know, GIs always like to have pets, but the dog seems to be more intent with the photographer in this picture than what's going on around them with that mission briefing for the jump. Okay, so the two jumps were labeled. They had two different, the two jumps for Operation Husky that would be made by the 82nd were simply named Husky 1 and Husky 2. So Colonel James Maurice Gavin's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment would make the first combat jump of the 82nd in the Second World War during Husky 1. So the regiment would be designated as a regimental combat team because they would be augmented with additional forces for that jump. So all three battalions of the 505th would jump. The first of the 505 was led by Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Gorham, second of the 505 by Major Mark Alexander, and third of the 505 by Major Edward Cannonball Krause. They would also be reinforced by the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Coons. Also part of this regimental combat team would be a Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, Company B of the 307th Airborne Engineer Battalion, and then elements of both the 307th Medical Company and the 82nd Signal Company would go with them into Sicily. So the 505th mission was to capture and secure the high ground just east of the town of Gela in order to prevent enemy movement towards the landing beaches, and then to assist the 1st Infantry Division in capturing and securing the landing field at Ponte Olivo Airdrome. Excuse me, I'm getting crazy with the slides here. Sorry about that. Now, so you can see in these two photos, the paratroopers of the 505th are helping each other into the parachute harnesses and rig their gear, as well as loading what we call the Parapack bundles on these racks that were mounted underneath the C-47s. The Parapack bundles would carry the heavier equipment that the paratroopers couldn't individually jump on them. So they'd have machine guns, mortars, the bazookas, anti-tank bazookas, as well as resupplies of ammunition, rations, and that kind of stuff. Now, what's interesting, I want you to pay attention here. So this aircraft has been identified as a Douglas C-47, serial number 41-18341, and her nickname was the Lady from Hades. It was assigned to the 61st Troop Carrier Squadron of the 64th Troop Carrier Group during the jump. Now, if you notice right here, it has this D1 marking on the side of the fuselage. I want you to just remember that, because I found this additional photo. There's the same airplane, and paratroopers loading onto that aircraft for the jump. So you got to think they're wearing anywhere from 65 to 85 pounds of equipment, plus the 35-pound parachute and their weapons. So some physical fitness has definitely been the hallmark of the Airborne since it began, and it is to this day. Just a lot of gear they had to carry and then get into that airplane as well. And here's a great shot as well of showing them rigging up by the C-47. You can clearly see the Mae West and the other equipment around that they're strapping onto themselves as they get ready for the jump. Now, one thing that's interesting, folks, I want to point out, with all this weight, there was a planning consideration not a lot of people realize, and it's what we call the aircraft fuel to weight ratio. Now, normally the C-47s that were going to take the 82nd into Sicily could carry 23 paratroopers, all right, in any given day. So if you were going to jump school here at Fort Benning during World War II, you'd have 23 guys in one of those airplanes as you conducted a jump. But because of the fact that the aircraft had a pretty good amount of weight on it, and the weight that each paratrooper was carrying, and the aircraft had to fly across the Mediterranean, drop in Sicily, and then get back to North Africa, the fuel to weight ratio came into play. So when you look at the manifests of how many paratroopers jumped or were loaded in each C-47, the load lists don't go above 18 personnel. They don't go anywhere near that 23, simply because of that fuel weight ratio and making sure the airplanes had enough fuel to get back to North Africa after the jump was done. So here, this is one of my favorite photos, probably of General Gavin, he would become General Gavin, of Colonel Gavin during the Operation Husky. So here's Colonel Gavin here, grease paint on his face, talking to the guys that he's going to jump into combat with for Operation Husky. And this is what he's doing. And part of that briefing was he wrote this letter, had it printed on sheets of paper, and it was handed out to the troopers of the 505th before they got in the airplanes that night. So, soldiers of the 505th Parachute Combat Team, tonight you embark upon a combat mission for which our people and the free people of the world have been waiting for 2 years. You will spearhead the landing of an American force upon the island of Sicily. Every preparation has been made to eliminate the element of chance. You have been given the means to do the job, and you are backed by the largest assemblage of air power in the world's history. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of every American go with you. Since it is our first night, and at night you must use the countersign and sign and countersign to avoid firing on each other. The bayonet is the night fighter's best weapon. Conserve your water and ammunition. The term American parachutist has become synonymous with courage of a high order. Let us carry the fight to the enemy and make the American parachutist feared and respected throughout all his ranks. Attack violently, destroy the enemy wherever found. I know you will do your job. Good landing, good fight, and good luck. Signed, Colonel James Maurice Gavin. Pretty motivational speech. It always gets me every time I read it. So now here's the route that they're going to take from Kairouan across. What they would do is they would fly across the Mediterranean to the island of Malta, and then kind of turn north to make the run into Gala, and then they would fly back to Kairouan afterwards. Now, one of the things they noticed as it got closer towards the jump time, the winds began to pick up considerably. Wasn't too much of a concern initially, but when the aircraft were loaded and getting ready to take off, the winds had increased to 35 miles an hour, which is 20 miles an hour past what's considered safe for parachute operations. But the mission was a go. They couldn't turn back now. So the aircraft took off and headed towards Malta and to the coast of Sicily. So Colonel Gavin, the 505th, proceeded in 227 C-47s. That's what was required to bring the entire regimental combat team for the jump into Gala. And they were planned to jump shortly after midnight. Now, because of the winds, the winds as they got across the Mediterranean to Malta, whipped up into gale force level. Like in some places at altitude, they estimate the winds were 50 to 60 miles an hour. So as they made their turn at Malta as a reference point to make the jump into Gala, the aircraft started to get widely scattered and spread out. Another phenomena of that part of Sicily is wind will come across the Mediterranean, across the Gulf in front of Gala, and then it will whip up dust from the coastline, and it will go up to almost 2,000 or 3,000 feet. So not only do they have winds to deal with, they now have dust that's obscuring their ability to even see where the drop zones are, and it's at night. And most of these flight crews, this was their first airborne drop, and let alone their first airborne drop at night. So a lot of factors came into play here. But on the backside of that, the weather actually contributed to the Allies' favor because of the choppy seas and the gale force winds and all the dust blowing around. The Germans and the Italians didn't think that the Americans or the Brits or the Allies were going to invade that night because of such terrible weather conditions. So it kind of, despite all the setbacks they were facing, it kind of helped us in our favor with that. Here in this photo, you can see the color photo of a C-47 actually taken off from one of the airfields in North Africa. And here's a picture of a typical flight crew of a C-47. Pilot, co-pilot, radio operator, and then 2 crew chiefs in the back for the paratroops. Okay, so as they get ready to do they get ready and they're flying, and as they begin to jump on the drop zones in near Gala, their jumps are widespread all over the place. So if you look at this graph here, these 3 circles are where the units are supposed to jump. So 3rd of the 504, first of the 505, 2nd of the 505, 3rd of the 505, and then I company of the 504. These are their intended drop zones. If you look here, these are where the drop zones all were. I mean, they're all over the place on the Sicilian mainland. And there were 30 aircraft that even dropped farther east to that, with one aircraft actually dropped almost 40 miles away from their intended drop zone. Now, a kind of a legend came out of for the airborne community, came out of all those misdrops and all that stuff that night, and we still use that term today in the 82nd Airborne Division. It's called the LGOP, L-G-O-P, which it's acronym for Little Groups of Paratroopers. And what that is despite where you land in the middle of the night, if you're not really sure where you are, you and your buddies that are around you get together and you move towards the sound of gunfire and figure out what's going on. And that's what a lot of these misdrop paratroopers from the 82nd did. Despite being misdropped nowhere near, in many cases, where they were supposed to be, they gathered up who they could from that drop and moved toward the sounds of gunfire and to mix it up with the Germans and the Italians. An unintended consequence with that is because there were so many spread out these little groups of paratroopers all over the southern part of the island, that the Italians and the Germans thought there was a much larger enemy force on the island than actually was, because of the volume of contact reports they were getting of enemy action against the Germans and the Italians. Now, it's particular here also to a great example of the rule of the LGOP. So Lieutenant Colonel Charles Coons was the battalion commander for 3rd of the 504, and that's him in the airplane getting ready to take off from North Africa. So his paratroopers are dropped almost 20 to 30 miles away from where they're supposed to be. So he links up with the lieutenant and 9 of the other paratroopers that were in the aircraft with him, and they begin moving towards where they hear the sounds of gunfire. Over the next 3 days, they come face to face with elements of the Hermann Goering Division. That's the German Panzer Division I spoke of earlier in the briefing. And despite the fact of only being 11 guys, they were armed. They did have bazookas and various small arms with them. So this little group of paratroopers managed to destroy 2 light tanks, 3 trucks, and killed a small group of German officers and about 40 German soldiers. For about 3 days, they were getting chased by the Germans and the Italians throughout the vineyards of Sicily, and they ran out of ammunition, they ran out of food, and they ran out of water. and they ended up surrendering to the Germans. Kuhns tried to escape 2 or 3 times, but he was recaptured every time, and he would sit out the rest of the war as a prisoner of war, a German prisoner of war through the end of World War II. When we talk about the little groups of paratroopers, I mean, 11 guys in the countryside just raising havoc. Definitely a hallmark of the American parachutists to this day. Here's some photos of the amphibious landings that took place both at Gala and the southern part of the island. So here's U.S. and British soldiers coming ashore at the Gala beachhead, and then here to the right are some British soldiers coming ashore near just south of Syracuse. And before I move on, and the first day of landings between amphibious forces from the British, the U.S., and the airborne forces, we had 170,000 Allied soldiers land in that island. So a lot of combat power concentrated in one day. So here's Husky 2, the 504th Parachute Infantry, as they're getting on their aircraft late on the 10th of July 1943, as they get ready to jump. And here's a great color photo of the 504 guys as they're moving towards an aircraft to get in parachutes and jump. And this is another great photo here. This is Colonel Reuben Tucker. Colonel Tucker was the commander of the 504th in Sicily, and that's him clutching his folding stock M1 carbine, getting ready to get on a C-47 for the jump into Sicily. More pictures of the 504 in their aircraft and en route to the drop zone on the 10th of July. So it's 2,000 paratroopers of the 504th, a little bit smaller element than the 505th had, and they took off around 7:30 or 19:30 local time from North Africa to head to Sicily for the drop zones, pretty much the same ones behind Gala. Their projected drop time is between 11:30 at night and a little 30 minutes after midnight, so about a 1-hour window of when they were supposed to arrive. Now, unfortunately, a very terrible thing happened to Husky 2, to the 504 when they arrived over the Gala beachhead. So the 504th, there was a lot of consternation about the fact that off the coast of Gala was the Allied invasion fleet. The dozen of support ships, destroyers, cruisers, other like landing craft that were there to support the amphibious landings that happened at Gala, as well as eventually the 82nd and the other airborne forces to resupply them. When they planned the route, the 504 was going to fly right over the invasion fleet and then drop on Gala, which caused a lot of great concern for the commanding general of the 82nd, Major General Matthew Ridgway, because he was very concerned that all it took was that his aircraft would get engaged by our own guys, because they had no way of knowing who was who. They had no air-to-ground communications between the aircraft and the fleet and the Navy ships, so he was very concerned about this. Now, they did send messages to the ships about not firing on the C-47s that as they were getting ready to approach the drop zone, but because of communications issues, radios broken or not working, the message did not get out to everybody in time. So the 144 C-47s that carried the 504th, as they were due to arrive over their drop zone, at about 9:45 that night, the German Luftwaffe had a bombing raid on the ships off the coast of Gala, on the U.S. ships. They were twin-engine Junker 88 bombers that did a bombing attack on our ships. 40 minutes later, here come the twin-engine American C-47s carrying the 2,000 soldiers of the 504th. And this picture right here shows the gunfire the tracer fire from the ships off the coast of Gala. Once the first gun began firing, they couldn't stop it. There was a massive torrent of anti-aircraft fire and traces that lit up the night sky over Gala. The 505th guys already on the ground watched in horror as their brother paratroopers from the 504 were getting chewed up by our own anti-aircraft fire, and they were absolutely helpless to do anything about it, because the other thing was the C-47s were flying at 1,000 feet. So, they were just sitting ducks. Of the 144 aircraft that dropped the 504th, 23 of those aircraft were shot down by friendly fire, and 37 were damaged, but did make it back to Sicily. they lost the 504th lost 81 paratroopers killed, 132 wounded, and 16 missing. The pilots and aircrew from the C-47s, they had 7 dead, 30 wounded, and 53 missing. One of the aircraft that made it back to Sicily, or made it back to North Africa, had over 1,000 bullet holes in it, but was still able to fly. And unfortunately, amongst all those casualties, Brigadier General Charles Kierans, who was the Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, was lost listed as missing in action as his aircraft crashed at sea, and nobody was ever recovered from it. So a tremendous loss of life, and really, really horrible thing that happened. But let's fast forward 11 months later towards D-Day. So folks, if you look at this picture, this is a C-47 getting ready to load up paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division for D-Day. Do you notice these black and white stripes that were painted on the aircraft? Those were painted on the aircraft and are commonly known as D-Day invasion stripes. So that if the C-47s, if an Allied ship looked up and saw an aircraft with those black and white stripes painted on it, they knew it was an Allied aircraft and not to fire on it. So hard lessons learned, but that's where those stripes came from on the aircraft you see during D-Day. So this is also the baptism of fire for the use of the American-built Waco CG-4A gliders. But what's interesting was the U.S., we weren't the first ones to use it. It was the British Army. So the British paratroops of the 1st Air Landing Brigade used our American gliders to land in positions just south of Syracuse during Operation Husky. You can see here where the Brits are loading a Willys Jeep as well as waiting around an additional glider for the operation to happen. They had 136 American Waco gliders and 8 of the British-built Horsa gliders. Now, again, because of the high winds that were encountered during the operation and to evade enemy aircraft fire, 65 of the gliders were released too early or too high and crashed into the Mediterranean, killing 252 British paratroops that had been riding in those gliders. Another 59 of them landed up to 25 miles away from their intended landing zones. There were only 12 gliders out of that 144 that actually made it to their planned landing zone. So again, a lot of hard lessons learned about how to employ the gliders in an airborne operation like this. Here's as we get ready to wrap up, here's a few photos, actual combat photos of the 82nd in Sicily. Of note, so instead of carrying all that heavy equipment, they employed some assets from the local Sicilian countryside to carry some of that heavy equipment. And then here you have a patrol of 82nd troopers crossing a crossing point for a rail line in Sicily. This is on the road from Gala up into the ridge lines above the landing beaches towards the drop zones. And if you've noticed, the 82nd troops have captured these Italian light tanks and they're putting in these armored vehicles to use for their own means. Here to the right, here's Colonel Gavin on the 11th of July speaking with this guy, Jack Beaver Thompson. So Jack Thompson was a reporter from the Chicago Tribune as a war correspondent, and he actually made the jump into Sicily with the 82nd to report on it for the Chicago Tribune. And you can always tell pictures of Jack Beaver Jack Beaver Thompson because he's got a sweet beard going on right there. Try to get like him someday, but pretty. And the only thing as a correspondent, the only thing he was armed with was his pencil, a notebook, and a camera. So we couldn't even carry a pistol with him. So pretty brave guy in my book. Here's pictures of Major General Ridgway, the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division in Sicily. That's him here in the middle, and you can see the 2 stars on his helmet. Him with his staff riding in a Willys Jeep and pointing out some things to a press corps photographer. Ridgway didn't actually make the jump into Sicily. He chose to ride ashore on a landing craft just in case they encountered issues with the aircraft being shot down or that kind of stuff. So probably a good decision on his behalf to do that. So some snapshots as the combat operations are winding down. You always want to send a picture home to mom and dad. So this is Private Tackle for the 504th Parachute Infantry, having a snapshot being sent home to his family as the operations were finishing up in Sicily. Now these 3 paratroopers here are from the 3rd Battalion, the 504th, and they're enjoying some Italian ice and probably a warm day in Sicily. Now, if you look real closely, if you see here, you see this cross-looking patch. So this guy was a bazooka gunner And the bazooka men did such a tremendous mission against the German tanks during Operation Husky that Colonel Gavin authorized that this bazooka patch be worn on their sleeves. They were reportedly designed and sewn on their sleeves from a convent, some nuns in a convent near Trappiani, Sicily. This actual bazooka badge, I'm holding it in my hand, my gloved hand, is in possession of the archives of the 82nd Airborne Division Museum at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. But that was kind of like you saw a guy with that on his emblem on his shirt, and he was a pretty awesome guy for being able to do what he did with the bazookas. The last big thing we'll cover is the Battle of Biazole Ridge. So the Battle of Biazole Ridge was above the Gala landing fields, and it was one of the key objectives the 505th had to take. On 11 July 1943, the paratroopers of the 505th squared off against German Panzer and Mark IV Tiger tanks from the Hermann Goering Division. The heaviest thing they were armed with were these bazookas, as well as they had one functioning artillery piece. And it was a pretty close combat fight. Despite taking tremendous losses, the 505th managed to hold Biazole Ridge and prevented the Germans from getting through to the beachhead at Gala. So a very big historic fight in the 82nd's history. This gentleman here, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Gorham, who was the battalion commander of 1st of the 505th, he is awarded 2 Distinguished Service Crosses in 2 days for his actions in Sicily. The second Distinguished Service Cross he received was he had destroyed one German tank with a bazooka himself as a lieutenant colonel. As he was getting ready to engage the second tank, the tank got him. And because of his demonstrated leadership and bravery under fire, he received not only 1, but 2 Distinguished Service Crosses for his actions in Sicily. And this shows some 505 guys on one of the destroyed German tanks on the Biazole Ridge. And so lastly, folks, I just want to, here's a picture again of General Ridgway. This guy right here with the 1 star, that's General Anthony, he's the artillery commander for the 82nd Airborne Division. They're just conducting a briefing on a Jeep of what's going on. So in conclusion, Operation Husky was the largest amphibious operation of World War II in terms of size and the landing area and the number of troops put ashore in the first day. It was also a strategic success, giving the Allies a base in the Mediterranean, drawing German forces away from other theaters, including the Russians, and eventually toppling Mussolini's fascist Italy. So it was really the beginning of the end for Italy, as far as Mussolini and his the fascist forces working for him in Italy. It also provided many hard lessons learned for the use and integration of airborne forces in a large-scale operation across the entire European theater of operations, and would definitely come to bear 11 months later with the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Folks, here's some of if you're curious of where I get some of my sources and information, here's a bibliography I put together, some great books, some online sources, and some other publications where you can look up some stuff as far as you want to read more into the meat and potatoes of what a tremendous airborne operation in the history of the 82nd Airborne Division. And with that, and before we open up for questions, here's a photo of a headquarters company, 3rd Battalion of the 505th at Fort Bragg in 1943, before they deployed to Sicily for Operation Husky. And you got to think what we're going through those guys' minds, knowing that, hey, we're getting ready to go overseas and where we're going to go and all that kind of stuff. But just a great photo of some paratroopers from the 82nd. So pending anything else, I'm open up for questions.
I have a few questions. Do you have any artifacts at the museum from Operation Husky?
So great question. Do we have any artifacts specific to Sicily at the museum? Unfortunately, we do not. We do have some airborne related stuff, but I will tell you, I know there are some Sicily artifacts on display at the 82nd Airborne Museum at Fort Bragg, as well as the Airborne Special Operations Museum, which is in Fayetteville, North Carolina. But at our museum, at the National Infantry Museum, unfortunately, we don't.
I read somewhere that Hitler was not confident with the Italians' fighting skills Have you read anything about that?
So yes, so when doing the research for this thing, there was, and that's the reason why Hitler had so many German divisions and German soldiers, not only in Italy proper, but in Sicily. And the Hermann Goering Division was one of the top-notch divisions in the German army at that point. So the fact that they were there on Sicily spoke volumes of how critical that the Third Reich and Hitler perceived them being able to hold Sicily against the Allies. That, and because unfortunately, whenever the 82nd guys would face off against the Italian soldiers, in more cases than not, the Italians would surrender. Although they did put up a fight, but not as much or in depth as the Germans did in Sicily.
You mentioned numbers of the gliders that went down. Do you have any idea of the percentage of gliders that landed safely?
So the gliders, remember, that was only the British forces. With the U.S. didn't, we did have a glider infantry regiment in Italy, but again, it went to the discussion of allocation of the tow aircraft, the C-47s and that kind of stuff. So our glider infantry regiment and our glider units remained as a reserve in North Africa. The British gliders, of the 144 that were dispatched, only 12 of them landed. And I'm not so good with my math right now, but that's probably not a high percentage at all that actually made it to their objectives for that part of the mission.
How much would all of the equipment that the soldiers carried weigh?
So depending, for the paratroopers, the 82nd, and you kind of saw, the cargo pockets and the split bellow pockets and their M42 jumpsuits. Depending on what your job was the equipment that you carried. And in doing the research, it would be anywhere from 65 to 85 to maybe even 100 pounds of equipment that each parachutist had on them, plus the 35-pound parachute for them to go into Normandy. It just depended on whether you're a rifleman, a machine gunner, a squad leader. That was the equipment that you carried. It was particular to whatever your job was the gear that you carried. But again, they had to carry enough equipment for them to sustain themselves for at least 72 hours on the ground, because they didn't know when they were going to be resupplied, and it kind of bode well for them because the fact there were the misdrops were all over the island, and they, as a means of resupply, there wasn't really a guarantee of when they were going to get resupplied.
With Colonel Gavin's letter, is this unique, or was this something that officers did and wrote letters to their men before going into major engagement?
So that became, in my research, that was the first time that in a parachute unit that anyone had done that. Again, it was the 505th first jump. Throughout World War II, though, if you look down at that battalion or regimental size level, those tended to be more common as the war progressed, especially when it was a staged mission and they had the opportunity to get those messages made. There's a very famous General Eisenhower, a year later with the Allied invasion in Normandy, hands out a paper letter very similar to what Colonel Gavin did for all the Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen that participated in D-Day. But that became kind of a common thing after this point.
Okay, we have one more question. The 82nd, the ELGA.
Yes.
The low groups of paratroopers. Is that still in use today? Did you say that?
It absolutely is. And if for those of you that are on Twitter or Facebook, if you go and find the 82nd Airborne Division's website, the current division command team, Major General Chris Donahue and Command Sergeant Major Dave Pitt, both very good friends of mine, they have brought that term back into the vernacular of the 82nd, of that. They call it the hashtag LGOP. They even use it on Twitter. It's kind of cool they brought that back, because it's still very applies very well today to those little groups of paratroopers and what they can do.
We don't have any questions, but we do have a comment from the Brownlets. They said, "Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We learned a lot."
Well, I'm glad you guys were able to listen in, and again, it was my honor to be able to do this kind of stuff. History is important to me. And whenever I get to talk about my beloved 82nd Airborne Division, I'll take that opportunity anytime I can get it.
Thank you. I'll go ahead with that.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
There you go. No, there you go. My bad.
You're fine. Thank you.
Sorry. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Chris. That was a wonderful and informative presentation, and it will be on YouTube. I have been to the National Infantry Museum in Columbus. That's exceptional. My family absolutely loves it. So when it opens up, I put it on your to-do list. It's absolutely wonderful. Before we sign off, I want to share with you some upcoming presentations. For our fourth Friday from the Archives on July 23rd at noon, the topic will be Centuries of Fascinating Stories in Georgia History, investigating the collections at the Georgia Archives. The focus is going to be on family and friends. I will be giving that presentation. For our August 13th Lunch and Learn, the presenter will be Muriel Jackson, head of the Genealogical and Historical Room, Middle Georgia Regional Library.